What if I told you there was a punishment so terrifying, so unbelievably cruel that it makes every other execution method seem almost merciful? A form of torture so disturbing that its victims didn't just die, they deteriorated, trapped in their own bodies, fully aware of their slow and agonizing fate. For centuries, this method remained one of history's darkest secrets. Spoken in hushed tones, its horrors almost too gruesome to believe. It was designed not just to kill, but to break a person completely, turning them into something beyond recognition. This is the chilling story behind Scaphism, the most disturbing punishment you've never heard of. And if you love exploring the darkest corners of history, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, what actually is Scaphism? Imagine being trapped inside a wooden coffin, except this coffin isn't buried underground. Instead, it floats on the surface of a murky body of water. Your arms, legs, and head stick out, exposed to the blistering sun. You are force-fed food and drink, but not out of mercy. No, this is all part of the torture because what comes next is far worse than death itself. This nightmare was real. It was called Scaphism, also known as the boats, and it originated in the ancient Persian Empire. It is believed to have been one of the most brutal execution methods ever devised, with historical accounts detailing victims suffering for days, sometimes even weeks, before their body finally gave up. But where did this term come from? And how do we know about this monstrous form of torture? The word Scaphism comes from the Greek word scaph, meaning boat or hollowed-out vessel. The name gives us a clue as to how this punishment worked. Because the condemned was placed between two wooden boats or inside a hollowed-out log and left to die in the most excruciating way imaginable. Although the name we use today comes from Greek, this form of execution was believed to have been used by the Achaemenid Persians, one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. But why did they choose something so extreme? Scaphism wasn't just about killing a person. It was about making an example out of them. It was a message and a warning. Betray the empire, and your suffering will be legendary. The most famous account of Scaphism comes from Plutarch, a Greek historian and biographer who wrote about it in the life of Artaxerxes. He describes how a Persian soldier named Mithridates was sentenced to death using this method after committing an act of treason. But who was Mithridates, and why was he punished? Mithridates was a soldier in the Persian army who unwittingly sealed his fate by boasting about a deed he should have kept secret. During a battle in 401 BC, Artaxerxes II fought his own brother Cyrus the Younger, who was attempting to overthrow him. During this conflict, Cyrus was killed, and initially the cause of death was unclear. However, Mithridates, in a moment of arrogance, claimed responsibility for delivering the fatal blow to the rebellious prince. The boast was a grave mistake. Artaxerxes II had declared that he himself had slain his brother, and the idea that a mere soldier had done so undermined the king's authority. To make an example of him, the Persian ruler ordered that Mithridates be executed in the most excruciating way possible, through Scaphism. Plutarch describes how Mithridates was subjected to the horrifying process of Scaphism, where he was confined within two boats, force-fed milk and honey, and left to decay while insects consumed his body. His suffering reportedly lasts 17 days before he finally succumbed to death, making his execution one of the longest and most agonizing in recorded history. But there's something unsettling about this story. It is the only detailed written record of Scaphism that has survived. No Persian sources describe it, and historians have debated whether Plutarch exaggerated the method for dramatic effect. After all, Greek historians had a reputation for depicting their Persian rivals as barbaric and cruel. So, was Scaphism real, or was it a product of anti-Persian propaganda? The truth is, we may never know for certain, but what makes Scaphism so terrifying is that whether fully real or somewhat exaggerated, it was possible. The idea that a human mind could invent something so twisted is disturbing enough on its own. Although the word Scaphism is now used to describe this method of execution, the Persians themselves may have never called it that. Instead, historical references suggest that it was simply known as the boats, a name that emphasized its most chilling feature. In some texts, it has also been referred to as death by insects or torture by decay, both disturbing, accurate descriptions of what happened to the victims. Some historians have even speculated that similar methods might have been used in other cultures throughout history, but with different names. For example, in William Shakespeare's play, The Winter's Tale, a character describes punishment eerily similar to Scaphism: being flayed alive, coated in honey, and left for the insects to consume. While this is a fictional reference, it shows that the concept of using insects to prolong suffering had long haunted the human imagination. Another reference appears in H. Rider Haggard's novel, The Ancient Allen, where a character is sentenced to death by the boat. The description is almost identical to Plutarch's account, proving that Scaphism has fascinated and horrified writers for centuries. And now that we've explored the origins and histories of Scaphism, it's time to face the true horror. The first step in Scaphism was stripping the victim of everything: their clothes, their dignity, and ultimately, their humanity. Naked and vulnerable, they were placed inside a wooden structure, usually two boats fitted together or a hollowed-out tree trunk. The design was deliberate. Their head, arms, and legs were left exposed to the outside world while their torso remained tightly trapped within. There was no room to move, no way to escape, and nowhere to run. Once the boats were sealed shut, the condemned was left helpless, trapped in a wooden prison that would soon become their tomb. At first, they might have held on to hope. Perhaps they thought the executioners would return with a sword or a blade, offering a swift end to their suffering. But Scaphism was not about quick deaths. It was about prolonging agony, pushing the limits of human endurance until the body gave in to decay, disease, and despair. The next step was even more disturbing. The executioners would bring bowls filled with milk and honey and begin force-feeding the victim. They weren't given a choice whether they wanted to eat or not. The sticky mixture was poured down their throat, forcing them to swallow until their stomachs were painfully bloated. At first, this might have seemed like an act of mercy, but it was far from it. What the victim didn't realize was that this meal was meant to turn their own body against them. Milk and honey, when consumed in excess, causes severe diarrhea. And since the victim was trapped inside the wooden enclosure, they had no way to clean themselves or escape their own filth. Within hours, their lower body was covered in waste, creating the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and infection. And the worst part, the process would be repeated daily. The executioners ensured that the victim did not starve too quickly. They needed them alive for the true horrors to unfold. As the victims sat in their own filth, the insects arrived. The executioners would smear more honey over the victim's exposed skin, covering their face, neck, hands, and feet in a sticky, sickly, sweet substance. The honey attracted flies, ants, and other vermin, which eagerly crawled onto the helpless body, biting and stinging as they fed. The more the victim struggled, the more they attracted attention. Wasps and bees drawn to the honey would sting their exposed flesh repeatedly. At first, the pain might have been tolerable, but over time, the swelling and irritation became unbearable. Then came the maggots. Flies, having laid their eggs in the filth and exposed wounds, soon produced writhing larvae that burrowed into the skin. The victim was still alive, fully conscious and able to feel every movement as the insects feasted upon them. Infections set in quickly. Open sores filled with pus. Flesh turned black and rotted away. Yet the heart continued to beat. The body was failing, but death refused to come as swiftly. Days passed, and with them dehydration became another tormentor. The victim was left exposed to the merciless sun, their skin cracking and blistering under the intense heat. At night, the temperatures dropped, causing violent shivering and muscle cramps. With no clean water to drink, their lips became dry and cracked, their throats parched and raw. They begged for water, but all they received was more milk and honey, just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to quench their thirst. Some victims were placed near swamps or stagnant water where even greater horrors awaited them. Mosquitoes, leeches, and even small rodents found easy prey in the helpless, decaying body. Rats, smelling the scent of festering flesh, would gnaw at fingers and toes, sometimes even chewing through the skin while the victim was still alive. Can you imagine the terror of feeling something bite into you knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it? After days, sometimes weeks, the body began to shut down. The combination of severe dehydration, massive infection, septic shock, and exhaustion took its toll. The heart grew weaker, the breathing more shallow, and finally, after untold days of suffering, the victim slipped into death's embrace. But for those who witnessed Scaphism, the true horror did not end there. What remained was a grotesque, barely recognizable corpse, its flesh eaten away by insects, its bones peeking through rotting skin. We have already mentioned that this terrible method originates from Persia, but to fully understand its purpose, we need to step back and take a look at the empire that created it. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, was built on order, discipline, and an unshakable belief in absolute loyalty to the king. Under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius I, Persia expanded into a vast empire stretching from modern-day Turkey to India. It was a wealth of empire, culture, and military power. But it was also an empire that did not tolerate betrayal. Persian law was complex, influenced by religious principles and a structured legal system. But when it came to treason, mercy was not an option. The Persians understood that a single act of betrayal could unravel the stability of an entire kingdom. A soldier deserting his post, a noble conspiring against the king, a general overstepping his authority. These were not just crimes. They were seen as threats to the survival of the empire itself. The Persian kings, despite their reputation for diplomacy and tolerance, had a darker side when it came to punishing those who defied them. While they ruled with wisdom, they also ruled with terror. And in their arsenal of punishments, one stood out as the most sadistic, drawn out, and psychologically devastating. Scaphism. Unlike ordinary executions, Scaphism was not handed out lightly. It was reserved for the worst of the worst: traitors, military deserters, and those who dared to challenge the authority of the throne. A thief might lose a hand. A murderer might be put to death. But a traitor deserves something far worse than a quick death. Persia's rulers were not just powerful, they were feared. Their laws, though structured in advance for the time, were designed to instill absolute obedience. Every soldier, noble, and official knew that stepping out of line could lead to a fate worse than death. The Persian army, one of the most disciplined forces in history, relied on strict military codes. Soldiers were trained to be unwaveringly loyal. Desertion was not just cowardice, it was treason. And treason could meet Scaphism. Imagine standing in formation, watching as a fellow soldier who tried to flee the battlefield is dragged away, knowing exactly what awaited him. Would you dare to run? Even within the royal court, no one was safe. Nobles who whispered of rebellion, officials suspected of disloyalty, or spies caught aiding an enemy all could find themselves condemned to the boats. And the worst part, everyone knew what Scaphism was. It was a form of punishment so infamous that just the mention of it was enough to strike fear into the hearts of even the most powerful men in Persia. This was the true purpose of Scaphism. It was never just about execution, it was about psychological warfare, a message burned into the minds of those who witnessed it. Betray the king, and you will suffer a fate so cruel that death will become your only wish. While the Persian Empire is often remembered for its advancements like road systems, tolerance of different cultures, and architectural wonders, its justice system had a dark side. Scaphism was not the only brutal punishment in Persia, but it was one of the most terrifying. Alongside impalement, crucifixion, and being torn apart by animals, it stood as a reminder that power is often maintained not just through diplomacy, but through fear. The Persian kings believed in justice, but they also believed in dominance, and Scaphism was the ultimate statement of control. A slow, agonizing death that sent a clear message: defy the empire, and you will not just die. You will suffer in ways no human should ever endure. The next time Scaphism was mentioned, it was centuries after the fall of the Persian Empire, when a Byzantine chronicler named Johannes Zonorus unearthed its horrors once again. Writing in the 12th century, Zonorus built upon Plutarch's account, offering a gruesome retelling of one of history's most disturbing punishments. Even though he lived long after the practice had faded into obscurity, his chilling description reignited its infamy, ensuring that Scaphism would not be forgotten. Zonorus, a historian and former imperial officer in the Byzantine court, was no stranger to the darkest sides of human history. His writings explored the political struggles, wars, and intrigues of past civilizations. But when he described Scaphism, his tone took on a particularly horrifying edge. He did not merely summarize Plutarch's account. He painted a scene of suffering so vivid that it could make even the most hardened reader shudder. Zonaras didn't just recount a method of execution. He also explained what was happening on a psychological level during this torture. Scaphism was far more than just a method of execution. It was a psychological weapon designed to strike fear into anyone who even considered defying the ruling power. Death alone was not the punishment. It was the slow, inescapable nightmare leading up to it that made this form of execution truly horrifying. The condemned were not simply killed, they were turned into living warnings. Their suffering stretched out for days or even weeks, ensuring that the mere mention of Scaphism was enough to make people tremble. Most executions happen quickly. A blade, a rope, an arrow, whatever the method. Death is usually swift, but Scaphism stretched death to its absolute limit, forcing the victim to experience their own decay. Every passing hour, their condition worsened. The stench of rot and waste surrounded them. The sounds of buzzing flies and squirming maggots filled their ears. They felt everything. The stings, the bites, the crawling of insects burrowing into their flesh. But there was nothing they could do. And that was the true horror of Scaphism. It was not just about pain, but about hopelessness. The victim knew they were dying, but not when it would happen. Their body was shutting down piece by piece, yet their mind remained alert enough to experience every second of it. Could there be a more nightmarish way to go? And if the pain and slow death weren't enough, Scaphism stripped its victims of all dignity. They were force-fed like animals, left to lie in their own filth, unable to move, clean themselves, or even swat away the creatures consuming them alive. They were reduced to something less than human, not just in their own minds, but in the eyes of those watching. And yes, there were always people watching. Scaphism wasn't meant to be hidden away in a dark prison cell. It was often carried out in public spaces where anyone who passed by could witness the suffering. People would stare at the writhing, half-dead figure, whispering to each other, wondering how long they would last. Some might have looked on with pity, others with morbid curiosity. But one thing was certain: no one left without feeling a deep, lingering fear. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of Scaphism was the role of the executioners. Unlike a simple beheading or hanging where death was immediate, Scaphism required constant effort. The victim had to be force-fed every day. Their body had to be smeared with fresh honey. Their condition had to be monitored and maintained to make sure they suffered for as long as possible. Think about that for a second. Someone had to do this. But the real question is, was Scaphism really that bad? Well, the answer is yes. What's more, it was so brutal that it served as an inspiration for some of the most infamous methods of torture and execution throughout history. The sheer horror of being trapped, force-fed, and consumed alive by insects left such a lasting impact that echoes of this punishment can be seen in later civilizations. The Romans, for example, perfected crucifixion, a punishment designed to be both agonizing and humiliating. The condemned were beaten, stripped, and nailed to wooden crosses, forced to endure exhaustion, dehydration, and unbearable pain for hours or even days. The Romans understood that the true power of an execution was not in the act itself, but in the fear it instilled in those who witnessed it. Just like Scaphism, crucifixion was a warning, a message that those who defied authority would suffer in the most excruciating way imaginable. But even crucifixion, for all its cruelty, lacked one key element that made Scaphism unique. In crucifixion, the body was pushed to its limits, but it was still a human death. The person bled, suffocated, and eventually perished. Scaphism, on the other hand, transformed its victims into something else entirely, something less than human, something unrecognizable. It turned the body into a breeding ground for decay, allowing nature itself to consume the condemned from the inside out. Even outside of Rome, the concept of death by insects and exposure found its way into other cultures. In medieval Japan, criminals and traitors were sometimes tied to stakes in swamps or left in bamboo cages, where insects, animals, and the elements would slowly finish them off. It was an execution method designed to humiliate as much as it was meant to kill. While the details differed, the essence of Scaphism remained, letting nature do the killing while ensuring the condemned suffered every step of the way. The echoes of this horror even reached the 20th century, where history's darkest moments revealed terrifying similarities to Scaphism. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 conducted brutal human experiments using flesh-eating insects on prisoners to study how wounds would rot and fester over time. Victims were deliberately infected with parasites, left in swampy conditions, and even exposed to insects designed to eat them alive. It was the same kind of slow psychological torture that made Scaphism so horrifying, knowing that death was coming, but not knowing when. But despite these later methods, none of them could truly surpass the pure nightmare of Scaphism. Crucifixion caused agony, but at least there was an end. Death by exposure was cruel, but it lacked the deliberate force-feeding and slow decay. Even Unit 731's horrific experiments were scientific studies of suffering, not punishments meant to publicly destroy a person's body and dignity. Scaphism remained the worst of them all. It was not just a way to die. It was a way to suffer beyond what the human mind can comprehend. No other execution method, no matter how brutal, could compare to the sheer calculated horror of Scaphism. It was a punishment beyond death, descent into a fate worse than anything the world had ever seen. And for those who knew of it, it remained the ultimate nightmare, the most disturbing punishment ever created.